we finished up this series on shelters, and I was thinking, man, where do we want to go and what do we want to do? And I was tossing around several things. The book of James has been really meaningful in my life recently, just the process. And I thought it'd be fun to. I love getting into a book study. We've done a bunch of things, meandered through the Psalms, and we did look at what he said. So we looked at the Sermon on the Mount, and then we went through this series in the shelters, but. I love to just go into a book and just let it kind of resonate within us. And so I told Tammy this week, I said, man, maybe last week, I said, yeah, I'm just struggling because I got two. Joshua is really on my mind, and James is, and I'm not sure which. And she's very careful to say, well, Lord's just going to show you, And then yesterday when I told her I'm going to do Joshua, she was like, yes. I think that's the one she wanted to look at anyway. So it made me feel good that that was going on. So it's been a rich study, and it's brutal if you've ever studied the Old Testament. And what we're going to find in here, and I'm going to explain to you how it breaks down in a minute. This is where they're actually conquering the Promised Land, which is a fulfillment of a promise, but it's brutal. There's a lot of killing going on in that, and there's some sections which are, to be honest, they're a little boring. It's like when they're laying out the division of the nations and they're talking about stretches from here to there, and I'm like, because it's like I need to see a map if I'm going to figure out where that is. But you read it and it's just kind of just stuff, and then there'll be a list of names and things like that. And so we're not going to preach through that. I'm going to hit it, so it won't be an exhaustive verse by verse, although we will look at the entirety of the book. And what we're going to find is just what Samuel mentioned earlier, it's the faithfulness of God through this. And we're going to find his love and mercy for his people, no matter how obstinate they are. And yet we're also going to see that when he unfolds his wrath, it's brutal. Thank God that we have a buffer against that wrath called Christ. And so we're going to look at that. There is a lot of parallel, and I'm going to share that with you in a minute. So as we go through this, it'll make sense to you. But this is different than just your normal message, where there's some points, and this we're just looking at narrative and pulling out truth. So what I needed to do, this is almost like, I may go back and do the prequel. So we may go back and look at Abraham, right? Because Joshua, we just jump right into the middle of the scriptures. But I'm going to help it make sense to you if you never grew up with understanding any of that. We're going to look at it. And quickly, I just kind of want us to wander through this. So you remember that from Noah, which is where, remember, God got so disappointed with everything that mankind had done. He said, man, I'm sorry that I made them. Everything, all they do, always, only, continually, is this destructive behavior. It's evil constantly. Yet I'm going to give them 120 days to repent. So there's God in his justice, sees a bunch of rebellious people, but I'm going to be merciful, and I'm going to give them 120 years to repent. That's the grace of God on those people. And so he sent Noah out. Noah out as a preacher, right? As he's building an ark, he's preaching the gospel. Nobody repented. So he and his family get on that ark. God closes the door, and the whole world is lost in a flood. So he starts over. He has 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, right? You remember those stories. So from Noah to Shem, which was his son, they repopulated all of the earth. There were 9 generations from Shem until we get to a man named Abraham. And so this is how all of that was pretty quick, right? I'm telling you, it's quick, right? So Abraham, God calls him out. There are no people, there are no Jews in those days. They're just nations, tribes, tongues. They're just people. God calls Abraham from the land of Ur and says, if you will leave your family and you will follow me where I take you, I'm going to bless you. And I'm going to make you a great nation. And from you, all nations will be blessed. For your seed will be a blessing to all the nations. And he didn't say to the seeds. He didn't say your people. This is what we miss. The people of Israel aren't the blessing. The seed that they brought from God himself, Jesus Christ, is the blessing. That's the blessing. The nation of Israel is going to do nothing to save us. It is the seed. It is the Savior. It is the King. It is the promised one. It is he who God even spoke about in the garden when he says, you serpent, you will strike at his heel, but he'll crush you, right? Who's he talking about? This seed. And so this is that promise. And so he takes Abraham, and Abraham's already an old man. Some years go by. And we know what happened. He promised him a son, and then he took him out and said, look at the stars. You're going to have that many kids. Then at one time he showed him the sand, as many as the grains of sand on the seashore. You're going to have that. Abraham and his wife, she laughs. Didn't go well for her when she laughed. And he was a disbeliever, really, like, come on, what's going on? And so they created a workaround. Right? Have you ever tried to do some workarounds whenever a guy's doing something? You go, let me just help him out, right? So you start trying to figure out a workaround to get to where you think he wants you to go. That's what they did. So she talks him, probably not a hard conversation. Hey, go, with Hagar, and he's like, are we sure about that? And he does. And she has a child named Ishmael. And God said, that's not the promise. That's not what I said. And Abraham was like, but we're old. And God gave him a son, Isaac, the son of the promise, right? That's how he's termed, son of the promise. And so we learn from that he is going to be the promise. And when Abraham believed God at the very beginning that if he followed him, God would make him a great nation, and he did believe him, it says, and God credited to him his righteousness. Abraham didn't have to work for anything. He just had to believe. He had to trust God. So when he gets to this place and Isaac is born, he's faced with another dilemma. Do you really trust that that's the son of the promise? Because I'm going to ask you, Abraham, to take your son, your only son, and go up on this mountain, and I want you to worship me, and I want you to sacrifice your son. Now we get a glimpse of Abraham's faith when he tells the men who traveled with him, and they're at the bottom of the mountain, and he says, I and the lad are going up, and we will return to you. Now you missed that in some sense, right? And so he knew that whatever was going to happen on that mountain, if he was going to kill his son, whatever was going to happen, he was going to raise him from the dead because God promised. And so when you read about him in the book of Hebrews, in the Hall of Fame of Faith, that's another place where it says that God had reckoned to him his righteousness because he believed that he could even raise him from the dead. And so that's what took place. And so then Isaac had Jacob. Remember the story of Jacob and all of his troubles? And then Jacob had 12 sons. This is where the story is. So there are 12 sons, which ended up being 12 tribes. Joseph was the next to the last. Benjamin was the rut, but Joseph was the next, the one just up from him. And you remember the story of Joseph, right? He because of his dream and because of how God took him on that journey, which was a crazy journey, but God is faithful to his promises, right? It took Joseph a lot of years before he saw the promise, but he saw the promise. And we learned some valuable things about that, but that's a whole nother story. All of Israel, all of the tribes, all of the 12 sons, all of Israel moved to Egypt. You tracking with me? New Pharaoh rises up. They don't know. They don't know Egypt. They don't know Joseph. They don't know Israel, but they realize those people sure do populate the earth. And if we let them continue, they'll overrun us. We need to put them in bondage. And so they did so. And so they were in bondage for a lot of years. Then Moses shows up. Deliverer, right? Why? Because God promised something to Abraham. And he's faithful to those promises. And so he tells Moses, you're going to go tell my people, our Pharaoh, to let my people go. And what was the whole point? To take them to the land that God promised that Abraham's seed would see. And so this whole thing is about getting Abraham's nation, this broad and huge, into the promised land, because he made a covenant with Abraham that he would give him a land, which is the promised land. He would give him a seed, which is Christ, Isaac, and then Christ ultimately, and a blessing. This is what he promised them, land and the seed and the blessing. And I will bless you. I'll make your name great. Right? And so he's faithful to that promise. It took 430 years for Moses to get where Moses got so that that would take place. And then some 500 years later, there's a man named Joshua that shows up. And this is our story. And this is where it is. And so what I want to do is kind of introduce Joshua to us today so we'll know him. So really, that's really just all my agenda. And to do that, we're going to kind of read through some scriptures, and I'm going to rattle them off, and I'm going to read them for you fairly quickly. So who is Joshua? Well, he's a son of Nun who had been Moses' assistant since his youth. That's what he was. Now, his real name is Hoshea, which means salvation. Sidebar, it's the same thing as Hosea. If you know that story and the picture of Hosea and a love that won't let go and God's faithfulness, even though through Hosea, Gomer was a prostitute and she wandered around, Hosea was her salvation. He, when she had run through every man she could have and was worn out and God had told him to marry her, she's on the auction block to be sold one more time. And Hosea, who's tried to wall her in and she wouldn't, who's tried to woo her back and she wouldn't, and is just as frustrated as can be, wouldn't quit. He just wouldn't quit. He bore his name, Hoshea is how that would be said. And he went and he purchased her. He bought his wife back from the slave block, clothed her and brought her home. That's the story of you and me. And then Moses changed his name from Hoshea. Moses called him Joshua, which means the Lord is salvation. Moses was giving Joshua a little lesson in really what's going on. Joshua, you're not the Savior. The Lord is salvation. And so he just twisted his name slightly to strike a message to Joshua. Now, Joshua, you remember, he was Moses' assistant as a young lad. All right, he's from the tribe of Ephraim. If you're just curious about all that, that's where he's from. And then he was one of the 12 spies that went out. Remember, as soon as Pharaoh got tired, that's loosely saying, Pharaoh got tired of the Israelites because they'd lost all their firstborn sons. He kicked him out. You remember the story. And so then Egypt had a bloody bath in the Red Sea. On the other side, Moses says, let's take our land. And so he got one man from each of the tribes. And I won't read the names to you, but from every tribe, there was one of these. And Joshua, there were two that stand out. Joshua and Caleb stood out because they went in and saw the very same thing everybody else did. Man, this is the Canaanite land. And everybody had great wealth there. The walls of the cities were fortified. The vineyards were plush and lush. And all of that was going on. And there were giants living in the land. And so the spies came back. You know, are you aboard the story yet? The spies came back, right? 10 of them go, whoo, whoo, the big giants in there. We should get plan B. And Joshua and Caleb like, aren't you kidding me? Did God not say we could have it? I want my portion. Now, Caleb's a young man at that time. We're going to hear at the end of the story of Joshua. I'll go ahead and tell you that little deal in the beginning. Joshua is 85 years old, and he goes, Caleb is. And he looks at Joshua and goes, hey, remember when we went into that land? Remember that spot? I remember the spot. Joshua, you remember that spot? We're standing in it right now. And I won. I know I'm an old man. I'm as strong today as I was then. I hadn't lost anything. I can still fight, and I can kick some tail. And I want that land. And he took it. And he settled his family there. And so these were the two. Now, in that story, it cost, because they didn't do what they should have done, it cost every man that was 20 years old or older to never see the promised land. Their lack of faith locked them out. Remember the story? That's why they wandered 40 years. All of them had to die out. The only people still living when they went into the promised land from that were Joshua and Caleb, and any man who was younger than 20 when they started the journey and however many women lived through that. That's all that went in. And so this is that story. You can read that. This is all in like Numbers 14. That's where all that comes through. Interesting too. He killed all of the others on the spot. Have you read these stories? Let me read something to you. Then the Lord said, I will pardon them as you have requested, but as surely as I live, the earth is filled with the Lord's glory. Not one of these people will ever enter that land. They have all seen my glory, my presence, the miraculous signs I performed both in Egypt and in the wilderness. And again, they have tested me by refusing to listen to my voice. They will never even see the land I swore to give their ancestors. They're just going to wander around in this desert. I'm not even going to let them get close enough to see it. They won't see it. But again and again they have tested me. They will never see the land I swore. None of those who have treated me with contempt will ever see it. But my servant Caleb has a different attitude than the others have. He has remained loyal to me. So I will bring him into the land he explored. His descendants will possess the fruit of their land. Now turn around and go on toward the land where the Amalekites and the Canaanites live. Tomorrow you must set out for the wilderness in the direction of the Red Sea. Then the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, how long must I put up with this wicked community and its complaint about me? Yes, I have heard the complaints the Israelites are making against me. Now I tell you this, as surely as I live, declares the Lord, I will do the very thing you heard me say. You will all drop dead in the wilderness because you complained against me. Every one of you who is 20 years old or older and was included in the registration, you're all going to die. You will not enter the land I swore to give you. The only exception will be Caleb. You said your children would be carried off as plunder. Well, I'm going to bring them to safety. Yeah, you didn't trust me. You thought I was going to let your kids get taken off as plunder. They're the only ones who are going to benefit. They're the only. I'm not taking care of you. You didn't think I'd take care of your kids? I'm going to take care of them. I'm taking care of you too. You're going to die right here. But your kids, I'm bringing them in. I will bring them safely into the land. Why? Because that's the God I am. And they will enjoy what you have despised. But as for you, you will drop dead in the wilderness. You like the way he says that about 8 times in there? And your children will be like shepherds wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. In this way, they will pay for your faithlessness until the last of you dies in the wilderness. Because you men explored the land for 40 days, you must wander in the wilderness for 40 years, a year for each day, suffering the consequences of your sin. Then you will discover what it's like to have me for an enemy. That's pretty brutal, isn't it? This is why it's important that sometimes we read this, because we have been spared from that, right? Romans tells me that the wrath of God is being stored up. Man, God is faithful, though. The Lord has spoken. I will certainly do these things to every member of the community who has conspired against me. They will be destroyed here in this wilderness, and here they will die. The 10 men Moses had sent to explore the land, the ones who incited rebellion against the Lord with the bad report, they died right there on the spot. Crazy. Scary, right? Now, Joshua, I'm embarrassed to tell you, I didn't know this. That's why I'm going to teach it. Well, you probably know it. I just didn't. You remember when God was going to take Moses up on the mountain and he was going to give him the law? And he gave fair warning. He said, listen, Moses, you're going to come up on this mountain. Put that barrier out there. Don't you let any of your people come, because if they touch the mountain, they're going to die, because my glory is that powerful. Now, this is what he said. Then the Lord said to Moses, come up to me on the mountain, stay there, and I will give you the tablets of stone which I have inscribed the instructions and commands so you can teach the people. So Moses and his assistant Joshua set out. I did not know that Joshua made it up that mountain. I'm way ignorant. Y'all shouldn't even have me as pastor. I didn't know that. I mean, I read it, but it didn't make sense. And Moses climbed up the mountain of God with him. Moses told the elders, stay here and wait for us until we come back. Aaron and Hur are here with you. If anyone has a dispute while I'm gone, consult with them. Then Moses climbed up the mountain, and the cloud covered it, and the glory of the Lord settled down on Mount Sinai, and the cloud covered it for 6 days. On the 7th day, the Lord called to Moses from inside the cloud to the Israelites at the foot of the mountain. The glory of the Lord appeared to the summit like a consuming fire. Then Moses disappeared into the cloud as he climbed higher up the mountain. He remained at the mountain 40 days and 40 nights. And then as those tablets were put together, It's Joshua up in that mountain with Moses that hears the music coming down on the mountain. And it says this in Exodus 32. These tablets were God's work, verse 16. The words on them were written by God himself. When Joshua heard the boisterous noise of the people shouting below, he exclaimed to Moses, "It sounds like war in the camp." But Moses replied, "No, it's not the shout of victory and the wailing of defeat. I hear the sound of celebration." And they go down there and find out what's going on, right? That they had all turned on God. And then we get to Exodus 33. We're going to do this fast. This is easy. God promises victory. But listen to what he says. The Lord said to Moses, Exodus 33. Are you tracking with me, or am I making sense? Sometimes it's clear in my head, maybe not with y'all. I just want you to see what's going on. Exodus 33. The Lord said to Moses, up on the mountain, "Get going, you and the people you brought up from the land of Egypt. Go up to the land I swore to give to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I told them I will give this land to your descendants, and I will send an angel before you to drive out the Canaanites, the Amorites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites. Go up to this land that flows with milk and honey, but I will not travel among you." He said, "You're going to go and do that, but I'm not going with you, for you are stubborn, rebellious people. If I did, I would surely destroy you along the way. I'm so mad right now. I'm going to let you have the land because I'm a promise-keeping God, but I ain't going with you, because if I went with you, I'd be slapping you silly." I love the fact that God just speaks plain English to the people of God like that. Has he ever spoken to you like that? I'm telling you. But I mean, it's just a powerful story. Listen. When the people heard these stern words, they went into mourning and stopped wearing their jewelry and fine clothes. For the Lord had told Moses to tell them, "You are a stubborn and rebellious people. If I were to travel with you for even a moment, I would destroy you. Remove your jewelry and your fine clothes while I decide what to do with you." You get this is like kids just getting chewed up, And so all of a sudden they're taking off their jewelry, right? And they're just, why? Because God said, "I'm mad at you, and you better get that stuff off," right? And all of a sudden, it's like when your dad says, "Hey, come here, it's going to be bad," and he tells you to do something. If he said, climb some mountain, yes, sir, right? I mean, because you're just trying to stay out of trouble. That's what the nation's doing, man. They're ripping off that jewelry, and they're getting rid of it. "Remove your jewelry and your fine clothes while I decide what to do with you." That's like, I used to do that with my kids. I wanted them to sweat just a little bit, so I would send them to my room, and I would intentionally not go there for two reasons. One, so they'd sweat, and two, I'd calm down, right? And you hear God, it sounds a lot like the same thing, doesn't it? Then he says, when the people heard the story, so from the time they left Mount Sinai, the Israelites wore no more jewelry or fine clothes. They were done with that. It was Moses' practice to take the tent of meeting. So there was this tent that they would carry with them, right? I mean, because they're nomads. So they'd wander around, and then they'd set up tent. Manna would come down. All that was going on. Water from the rock. They'd pick up tent, then move. Anytime that pillar of cloud, that fire or the cloud moved, they would get up, wrap up their tents and their campers and head out. And that's kind of what was going on. And so Moses had one called the tent of meeting, and he set it up some distant from the camp. Everyone who wanted to make a request to the Lord would go to the tent of meeting outside the camp. Verse 8. Whenever Moses went out to the tent of meeting, all the people would get up and stand in the entrances of their own tents. They would all watch Moses until he disappeared inside. As he went into the tent, the pillar of cloud would come down and hover at its entrance while the Lord spoke with Moses. When the people saw the cloud standing at the entrance of the tent, they would stand and bow down in front of their own tents. Inside the tent of meeting, the Lord would speak to Moses face to face as one speaks to a friend. Listen to this one. After Moses would return to the camp, but the young man who assisted him, Joshua, the son of Nun, would remain behind in the tent of meeting. Listen, I think that's worthy of note. You want to know how Joshua ended up commanding God's people and being the warrior that he was? Because he had spent time in solitude with God, very God, right? I mean, there's a lesson there. And I'm tempted to preach it, but there's a lesson there. You want victory out there in this world? It happens because you and I choose to spend time alone with him in our prayer closet and in the Word, letting it saturate us. There's no shortcut to this thing. This is what happens. And so that's what's going on there. So Joshua's lingering in the tent. Now we're going to fast forward. Joshua is appointed for leadership at this point, and it says this: Then Moses said to the Lord, O Lord, you are a God who gives breath to all creatures. Please appoint a new man as leader for the community. Give them someone who will guide them wherever they go and will lead them into battle, so the community of the Lord will not be like a sheep without a shepherd. God's already told Moses, you're not going to see it. You disobeyed. You're not going to see it. I'm going to take you up the mountain. I'm going to let you see it. And I'm going to take you home. That's it. Your day's up. And he's like, okay, don't you love this about Moses? He's like, yeah, but what about the people? Right? I mean, once a shepherd, always a shepherd. Moses can't quit loving the people. He could be mad at them because partly he could blame them for when the reason I got mad was them, Lord. It's the people you gave me. But he knew he sinned, and so he's okay with it. He said, but hey, what about the people? And the Lord replied, take Joshua the son of Nun, who has the Spirit in him, right? God had anointed him with the Spirit, and lay your hands on him. Present him to Eleazar the priest before the whole community, and publicly commission him to lead the people. Transfer some of your authority to him, so the whole community of Israel will obey him. What's he saying? Give him tasks so that everybody sees that he can do what you said, and there's trust. See how the Lord methodically is doing this? I could spend hours just meditating on what's going on there from a leadership principle and everything else. The Spirit of God was on him. And he said, Moses, I want you to lay hands on him. That's why we lay hands on elders when we have those in churches and those kind of things. And it's an outward showing of, hey, this is a passing of the torch. This is the fellowship saying this man is authorized to be a leader. And this is what God is doing through Moses in this whole concept. And then it says this, Joshua will stand before Eleazar the priest, who will use the Urim, one of the sacred lots cast before the Lord to determine his will. This is how Joshua and the rest of the community of Israel will determine everything they should do. So Moses did as the Lord commanded. He presented Joshua to Eleazar the priest and the whole community. Now you're going to read in the book of Joshua as we walk through it, that they'd pull out and they'd cast lots to see what was going to happen and where they would go and who they would send and all of those things. It was in those days a holy way. Now we truly have the Spirit of God who lives within inside us. The last time you ever see a lot cast, remember they cast lots for Jesus' cloth, but the last lot was when the 10 disciples or apostles said we need to pick another one, and they picked Matthias. You don't see it after that, because after that God gave us the Spirit, and He is our casting of lots. We cast all our care on Him. We ask Him for wisdom, right? And He's the one who gives us those insights. It is the Spirit, God within us now, who speaks to us. I no longer have to just cast lots. It's a whole other story, but there you go. Now, here's what happened. Numbers 34. Eleazar the priest and Joshua the son of Nun are the men designated to divide the grants of land among the people. So two men, Eleazar the priest and Joshua the general, are going to, when they go into the promised land, God put them in charge to say, you get this and you get that, and this is how we're going to divide this thing up. Now, we get to the last section, Deuteronomy 31. I do want to spend just a little time read this, and then a few comments, and we're done. But Deuteronomy is where Joshua, the whole mantle's transferred. I want you to hear this because it makes sense to us as we begin to look at this book. This is a lot of history, trying to wrap it up in a small deal. But listen to what it says. When Moses had finished giving these instructions, he reviewed the cursing and the blessings, and he had told them all of those things. When he finished that, all the people of Israel, he said, I am now 120 years old, and I'm no longer able to lead you. The Lord has told me you will not cross the Jordan River, but the Lord your God himself will cross over ahead of you. He will destroy the nations living there, and you will take possession of their land. Joshua will lead you across the river just as the Lord promised. The Lord will destroy the nations living in the land, just as he destroyed Sihon and Og, the king of the Amorites. The Lord will hand over to you the people who live there, and you must deal with them as I have commanded you. So be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid, and do not panic before them, for the Lord your God will personally go ahead of you. He will neither fail you nor abandon you. Did you catch the subtle nature of that? At the beginning of it, he's like, no. You bunch of obstinate folk. If I went with you, I'd slap you down right there. You see how God, this is why sometimes, and Tammy and I talk about this a lot, because you have a lot of people say, man, God of the Old Testament, he's just brutal and he kills everybody. He's just, and you think maybe you can see that, but you can also see the great mercy of God. 120 years he didn't do anything, right? And here you see where 40 years earlier he had said, "I'm not even going in there with you," and now he's like, "Hey, I'm going to lead you," right? And so it's just the mercy of God. It's just rich. So be strong and courageous. Don't be afraid, for the Lord your God will personally go ahead of you. He will neither fail you nor abandon you. Then Moses called for Joshua, and as all Israel watched, he said to him, so now he's looking at Joshua, brings him up, looks at Joshua and says, "Be strong and courageous, for you will lead these people into the land that the Lord swore to their ancestors he would give them." Don't you feel, it's got to be an emotional deal for Moses, because, it was him, man, who was just trying to hide out in the backside of a desert. He was done with life. And God wouldn't let him, spoke to him at a bush, made him go down when he was a stuttering fool in his own mind, and made him a powerful figure in the nation of Israel. Made him wander around for 40 years in the wilderness, and then said, "You can't take these people in." After putting all that hard sweat, blood, sweat, and tears, you just don't see grief in his life. You just see he's just a good man who just wants to honor God. So he's looking at Joshua, and instead of this bitterness or this envy that you would think would be there, it's not. He says, "Listen, you be strong and courageous, son, for the Lord your God will lead these people into the land that the Lord swore. You are the one who will divide it among them. Do not be afraid or discouraged, for the Lord your God will personally go ahead of you. He will be with you, and he will neither fail you nor abandon you." So Moses wrote this entire body of instruction in a book, and gave it to the priests who carried the ark of the Lord's covenant, and to the elders of Israel. Then Moses gave them this command: at the end of every 7th year, the year of release, during the festival of shelters, you must read this book of instruction to all the people of Israel when they give you the assembly. And he goes on and he speaks about the disobedience that Israel's going to do. Listen, God knows all things. Look at verse 14. Then the Lord said to Moses, "The time has come for you to die. Call Joshua and present yourselves at the tabernacle, so that I may commission him there." So Moses and Joshua went and presented themselves at the tabernacle. That's that tent of meeting. And the Lord appeared to them in a pillar of cloud that stood at the entrance of the sacred tent. The Lord said to Moses, "You are about to die and join your ancestors. After you're gone, these people will begin to worship foreign gods." Listen, he just said he's going to go in there and go before them, knowing they're just going to be an embarrassment and a disappointment to the God of all creation. His faithfulness is just overwhelming. Listen, you're about to die. All right, they will abandon me and break my covenant that I have made with them. Then my anger will blaze forth against them. I will abandon them, hiding my face from them, and they will be devoured. Terrible trouble will come down on them. And on that day they will say, "These disasters have come down on us because God is no longer among us. At that time I will hide my face from them on account of all the evil they committed by worshiping their other gods." So write down the words of this song and teach it to the people of Israel. Help them learn it so it may serve as a witness for me against them. For I will bring them into the land I swore to give their ancestors, a land flowing with milk and honey. Everything he said he did. They will become prosperous, eat all the food they want, and become fat. But they will begin to worship other gods, and they will despise me and break my covenant. And when great disaster comes down on them, this song will stand as evidence against them, for it will never be forgotten by their descendants. I know the intentions of these people, even now, before they have entered the land I swore to give them. So that very day, Moses wrote down the words of the song and taught it to Israelites. Then the Lord commissioned Joshua, son of Nun, with these words: "Be strong and courageous, for you must bring the people into the land I swore to give them, and I will be with you." And we'll stop there looking at that. When we get to the very last deal in Psalm 34:9, it says this: "Now Joshua, the son of Nun, was full of the spirit of wisdom, for Moses had laid his hand on him. So the people of Israel obeyed him, doing just as the Lord had commanded him." And so that's the introduction, so to speak. Let me real quickly give you an overview of the book. We got time for that. Where are we going to go, right? We're going to go eat lunch somewhere, but here, hang on. 1,300 years before Christ, this book was written. We discovered, I'm just giving you instructions. When you open up the book, you know what I hear all the time? How can you believe a fairy tale? And, all the Old Testament, this, that, and the other. And I'm determined that we would understand 1,300 years before Jesus was on the earth, Joshua wrote this. Most people say that he himself wrote this document and kept a journal of his deals. We found a copy of that manuscript in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and that document that they found was 200 years before Christ. So there's a gap now of 1,100, right? So he wrote it 1,300 years, but the only manuscript, the closest one we can find, was 1,100 years after that, 200 years old. And so people say, well, where'd they go? How come that happened? Well, there's this little thing called war that took place, right? So that he's doing his journal, he's going through, he's got it. They've settled the land. Judges come along, and there's evil that goes, and the judges do their thing, and then they say, we want a king, and Saul comes along, and then David comes along, and then Solomon comes along, and then the nation split, and they do exactly what God says, and they're full of rebellion and everything else, and they were overtaken, and they were taken from their land, and everything they had was torched and plundered, and they were scattered off somewhere else. Tell me why in the world you would think that there would be a manuscript that would have survived all of that stuff. It did, because when Jesus walked the earth, he had Joshua's letter in what he called the scriptures. And the very scriptures you hold in your hand is the very same scripture and order that we have it now, minus the fact that it was Chronicles, not 1st and 2nd. It was Samuel, not 1st and 2nd. It was Kings, not 1st and 2nd. And we have the collection of those writings. So I just want that for the record so that we all know what's going on. Now, when Joshua's writing, Egypt is in decline. Go figure, right? It was interesting because you may not care about this, but I asked ChatGPT this morning. I said, that's this AI thing that everybody's talking about. And it's liberal, just in case you're wondering. And so I asked it. I said, "What was going on?" And it wrote out, and it said that Egypt was in decline. Like he didn't know, or whatever it is, didn't know why. I'm like, you know why? Because they lost everything in the Red Sea, and because they lost all their firstborn sons. That's why they're in decline. And the Hittites are on the up, temporarily. It is the Iron Age, so weaponry is being formed. It was the Bronze Age, and now it's moving into the Iron Age. So their weaponry is getting bigger. If you know anything about like literature, it was the Trojan Wars, right? And so you've got the Greeks going to war with Troy over Helen of Troy. Most people would say that's a myth, but it's written in such a way that it's hard to really confirm that specifically. And so then Moses writes this book. And so chapter 1 through 5, there's a transition, and we're going to look at that. Chapter 6 through 12, it's these battles. 2 are major, Jericho and Ai, and then a bunch of little ones. He kind of sums those up. There's one of them, a man named Ehud, left-handed warrior, and it's kind of crazy what happens with all that. It's just fun stuff. Then there's the division of the land, which we probably won't look at. And then there's Joshua's speeches, which are incredible, and we will look at. Now, before we close, I just want to remind you of this. There's a parallel between Joshua and the book of Ephesians, so that we find ourselves in it. We can do that. Joshua is given blessings, right? He was promised blessings that they would take over the promised land. If you read Ephesians 1, he tells us we've been blessed with every spiritual blessing in the heavenly places. So the nation of Israel was offered these blessings. We have these blessings. There would be wars that they had to actually take the land, and we are told we have to put off the old man. We have to kill and crucify the old man. That's our land to take, right? They were taking physical land. We are killing off the flesh, the old man. And then they were going to do it how? By his spirit, because he had the spirit of wisdom. How do we do it? By the Spirit of Christ. That's what Ephesians tells us, right? There, he told them, when you go in, I want you to kill them all because I don't want you to live like the Canaanites. When he tells us, I want you to put off the old man because I don't want you to live like the Gentiles. That's who you once were, but you're not that anymore. And so we see a parallel. So when you read through these stories in the Old Testament, we can see how we can find ourselves in it. But let's be good biblical people when we do it. All right, that's the if it's called out a message, that's the message for today. But it sets us up for really some really good stuff that we're going to enjoy in the coming weeks. All right, let's sing our way out of here, and then we can pray together. Trying to figure out which song I want to do. I think I'll do this.